what an amazing group. And we're going to go straight into this session by asking each of the panelists to introduce themselves and share with us, in your view, the answer to this question. How do you know if a board of directors is taking climate change seriously? Because climate change, as we all know, is one of the hottest topics in the kitchen of sustainability today around the world. How do you know if a board of directors is taking it seriously? So we'll start off, if I may, with Darian. Would you like to introduce yourself and give us the first take on that question? How a board of directors taking climate change seriously? Over to you.
Thank you, Elaine, and thank you very much for inviting me here today. This has been such an interesting discussion I've been listening to for the rest of today. So I think, going with our kitchen theme, there are 3 secret ingredients that to me are really meaningful to spice up how boards are looking at climate change. And that would be the 3 Ds. So definition, data, and disclosure. Now, in this circumstance, I'm looking at definition as, what does it mean to the organization? How are they framing climate change? Is it purely to meet a regulatory requirement? Is it because they've made a net zero commitment or they're aligned with the science-based targets? And then once they look at it, how is it really feeding into their long-term resilience? So you really have to have a definition of why they're doing this. Next would be the data. Are they really kind of walking the talk? Are they measuring what they're doing? Can they show their trajectory and their pathway to a low carbon future? So that they're actually collecting that data and they can speak to it is very important. And then finally, the 3rd D would be disclosures. So are they sharing that information publicly? Can it be accessed? How much information can be accessed? And really, how confidently and competently can the board speak to that topic? And I think this is all important. And I should have said, I'm Darian McBain, and I am the Chief Sustainability Officer from the Monetary Authority of Singapore. Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks for that, Darren. 3 Ds. And quite coincidentally, your name also begins with a D. So maybe you're the 4th.
It's a theme.
The 4th special ingredient. Thanks for that. Eduardo, how about you talk to that question, please?
Welcome also from my side, and thank you for having me here in this panel. It's always an honor. Let's put it this way: I'm not a great cook, but I unfortunately have an analogy with skiing. I live in Switzerland, and if you ask in Switzerland if you are a good skier, 99% of the Swiss will say no, they're not a good skier. They know there is always a situation in which you don't really look that great on those skis. And similarly, I would say is with climate change. If you're really serious, you don't brag too much about it because you know how serious it is and how complicated it is to get to this target. And I heard in the last 18 months, everybody, oh, we got net zero, no problem, no problem. Always thinking that there is somebody else that will compensate whatever you emit. But it's not that is going to work. So going back to the question, I think it's very important, and unfortunately, I would say that there are also financial targets tied to achieving these goals. Usually this is what helps most to move this. Beside the fact, the 3 Ds, I fully agree, you need those, but you also need financial target. And then my last remark is watch out from people that are too loud, because probably they don't know what they're talking about.
Yeah, thanks, Eduardo. Interesting. Michael, how about your take on how serious boards are about climate change?
Thank you, Elaine, and also thank you for having me as well. Long-time viewer, first-time caller to the summit. My name is Michael Zimmerny. I'm the Policy and External Affairs Director at the CDSB, the Climate Disclosure Standards Board. We work on a framework for inclusion of environmental and social information into annual reporting. So here's my terrible kitchen analogy for you as well. You know, if you're trying to open a new restaurant, let's say I'm interested in opening a Singaporean restaurant, I first need to learn about the cuisine, and it goes to Eduardo's point, understanding and educating yourself about the science, about the actual, you know, subject matter. I'm Hungarian. I know how to make a good goulash, but laksa is something I need to learn about. Second, as you work through this, make this part of your overall strategy. We know vegetables are healthy. We know we should all eat them, but sometimes they're not as appealing as they could be if they're on their own. But if you put it into a nice dish, you can make it really palatable and really make it something that everybody will love doing or eating. And last but not least, keep checking the pot. Ensure that this is, you know, climate or sustainability is tabled and discussed in strategic, you know, interim strategic review periods, and then that it actually filters through to operational decisions. And maybe a last one, you know, make sure that the health inspector, make sure you built it into your audit function, and you have someone else look at it and making sure that you're going in the right direction.
Great, thanks, Michael. That's really, we're really getting into the kitchen with climate change. Of course, my solution to global warming is eat more ice cream, but moving on. Carol, great to see you again. How do you know if a board of directors is taking climate change seriously?
Well, hi, Elaine. It's good to be here. Well, I think you know if a board of directors is taking climate change seriously if they have oversight of the processes of identifying the material impacts of the organisation on sustainable development, and also the risks and opportunities presented by sustainable development issues, including climate change. So that's taking a holistic approach. And also if they are incorporating those risks and opportunities into their strategy, including consideration of current and future product and service offerings. And I think the last point I want to mention is that if the board has to be reviewing time-bound, quantified, science-based targets and progress against those targets. So I think my key point there is that if they think they can just look at climate change in isolation and they're not really getting to what the organisation is all about and its purpose, then they're not likely to do a very good job on climate change.
Great, thank you. Yes, you can't build a fabulous meal with one ingredient. Understand. Jonathan, hey, you've got all my great friends on this panel. Jonathan, how about your take on how you know if a board of directors is taking climate change seriously?
Well, great to see you again, Elaine, and thank you very much indeed for inviting me back. And I'm Jonathan Lebray, Chief Policy Officer at the Value Reporting Foundation. And we really come at this whole question of the board and corporate governance, obviously through the corporate reporting lens, but really using corporate reporting as triggers for better behavior, better capital allocation, and of course, better corporate governance. And I think where I would start very much in the kind of slightly in the weeds, but I think it's really, really important, is that it's really important that the board actually is able to elevate and escalate issues to do with climate to the monthly board meetings, that there is a process in place within the business that connects all the different parts of the organization, so that when issues are to do with risk or opportunity that are relevant to the board are actually escalated to the board. Now, we call that integrated thinking, the breaking down of those internal silos. But in practical terms, that means making sure that the company secretary, who's responsible for the board agenda, the internal audit team who are responsible for making sure all the key risks are properly chronicled, and then speaking to the corporate secretary to make sure that the agenda for the board is set properly, and really making sure that the teams within the business are properly connected. That is how you make sure that these sorts of issues get onto the board agenda. because so many boards that we speak to say, well, we'd love to be able to talk about climate change or the external environment, but we're so focused on compliance, we're so focused in our boardrooms on agendas that are set, sometimes not by the board themselves. So I think we need to get the board in control of the agenda and get them setting the internal balance. We need boards. We've seen throughout this symposium this whole idea of tone from the top. We need to make sure that we have boards that are committed to openness and transparency, that they're open to balance, so they're open to addressing the risks, not just telling the good story, but also highlighting the risks. And also that they have a really clear understanding of the expectations and needs of their key stakeholders and how that actually influences the strategy and the business model of the organization. So I think that would be my kind of opening gambit, Elaine.
Great. Well, thank you. So we've really got a great elements of the recipe for knowing how boards of directors are taking climate change seriously, whether it's through data, definition, data and disclosure, where it's about how loud you speak, whether it's about oversight, identifying material risk opportunities, setting targets, or whether it's about a topic that's actually on the agenda of the board every time they meet. So a really great checklist there for those who are looking to improve the way boards influence climate change strategy. And that's actually my next question. And I'd like to come back to Darian, if I may, and ask you, what do you think? You've talked about your 3Ds, but perhaps you could expand a little more on what are the key ways that the board should influence climate change strategy? How can they use these 3Ds to really make a difference?
So I think, firstly, they need to understand what the issues are, because if they are being told information from the executives which doesn't give a full picture, if they can't take into account all of the risks that are being proposed, and they don't have a clear vision for how they can move through the transition to a low carbon economy, then they are going to be challenged to fulfill their governance requirements. And so there are emerging supportive frameworks that can actually help with this. And I think the one I would flag now is the Climate Governance Initiative. And, this was set up by the World Economic Forum in 2019. You've got, I think, over 20 chapters around the world now. Singapore is just establishing its chapter. And this organization, specifically sets out 8 different areas where boards can become more familiar with all of the issues related to climate change, from accountability to how you need to structure boards, how you look at risk and opportunity. And I think it's fair to say that not all board members will be familiar with climate change. I mean, I look at my own career starting over 20 years ago, and nobody was talking about climate change then. We studied it at university, but it wasn't commonly in business parlance. So if you have perhaps board members who haven't been part of these discussions, they really need to become much more familiar with the language. They need to have a basic understanding, I think, of the science, and they need to understand how to apply it to risk, but also to business strategy.
Yeah, great, thank you. The Climate Governance Initiative, a sort of a roadmap for how directors can become familiar with the things that they need to do to drive strategy. Thanks for that. Moving on to Eduardo, because one of the tools that a lot of boards are using these days to talk about, climate change is the TCFD framework, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. Is this a useful accountability tool for boards of directors, as well as being just a disclosure tool? Is TCFD helping boards to drive change?
So the TCFD is a disclosure framework, as you mentioned. So it's not this that will implement the changes, but it definitely as a framework that helps to put in a structured way all the action that the corporation is taking in order to to tackle this issue. So I do believe that this helps, because if a company reports to that, then people will be able to witness and to control a little bit more what is going on. Evidently, if we don't put the meat, we don't have a dish. Sorry, no, maybe that's not appropriate in a society that's becoming vegetarian. But what I mean is,
Sure.
what I mean is that we still need the changes. But TCFD definitely helps to have a structured approach, to commit, and to be transparent about it, so that then there is the pressure that will come from having disclosed all that. So we do support it. We do think it's important, and we do that also in our methodology.
Yeah, and one of the things that a lot of people appreciate about TCFD is that it's forward-looking. It asks people to think about the future and plan for it, rather than what we've seen a lot of in sustainability reporting so far, which is backward-looking and what's been done so far. So that's clearly an interesting development with TCFD.
Yes, definitely. If just, I also have a couple of statistics where we see that in Europe there is already almost 50% of the company that we analyzed that they already have implemented it. In the other parts of the world, unfortunately, they're a bit lacking behind. But sure. If the last year tell me something, is that especially the Asia Pacific region and the Latin America will catch up very soon.
Great, thanks. So talking about TCFD and talking about commitments and future, so net zero, obviously the two words on everybody's lips when we talk about climate change. Michael, do boards of directors really know what net zero means? Are they making commitments, or perhaps avoiding commitments, without knowledge of the full implications for their company or for the planet of their net zero commitments?
Well, it's really a mixed bag. One thing that I think that was also one of the previous panelists alluded to is understanding, how offsets, etc., the net part fits into the net zero element, and that's not the primary strategy. That's really for those completely unavoidable emissions, and that's one area where we're really seeing a lack of knowledge. The other area where we're seeing is back to the learning the cuisine point. It's not evident to many that this, of course, needs to be linked to science, and that's a really troubling sort of development. So we need to make sure that we actually, again, do our homework, understand what actually this means. And if I can just cheekily link this back to the TCFD question as well, one element also that's important is, once you've made those net zero commitments, is to actually test. And scenario analysis, one of those elements of reporting under the TCFD, is actually a really good tool for you to look into possible future scenarios and see whether what you've implemented actually works. That's how you really get robust net zero commitments as well. So learn what it actually is and what it isn't, importantly, and test that it actually, what you've implemented actually is a good commitment.
Yeah, great, thanks for that. Now, Carol, when you spoke earlier, you talked about not just taking climate change in isolation, and we all know, there are 17 sustainable development goals, and obviously they're all interlinked, but there is only one goal on climate change. If climate change is only one of the SDGs, and arguably only one of a number of corporate priorities, although it is a pivotal one, is it enough for boards to focus on climate change? Maybe they think that everything else will resolve itself if we just do the climate change thing. Does this focus on climate change dilute our ability to advance the broader sustainable development agenda? What do you think about that?
Well, look, I know we're starting from a very low place, but I think we're setting the bar too low. I think we need a very different and holistic approach from corporations, and you can't get that by picking off one issue. And doing so, I think, limits your ability to progress on one issue. Integrated thinking is a start, but I think we need sustainable development thinking. So we need all organisations and boards to be leading by beliefs that the success of the organisation is dependent on sustainable development, including limiting temperature rises. We need boards that believe that organisations must seek to create value for society and the environment as well as the organisation. And we need boards that believe that strategy must seek to make a positive impact on sustainable development, including climate change. And that's a very different way of thinking, I think, than just thinking about, well, we've got to do something about climate change within the current paradigm and way of operating. So I think we need leaders to be able to deal with that complexity and the interconnectedness of sustainable development issues. When I interviewed board directors in South Africa, admittedly a while ago, and this is on my mind, a lot. They weren't thinking about climate change. They were thinking about poverty and inequality, and the way that limits their business, and the way that it threatens civil unrest and therefore limits incoming investment to the country. Now, these issues can be exacerbated by climate change, and by climate change and strategies to address climate change if we're not thinking more holistically. So that's one part of it. But the real, point that I want to make is that we need a different way of thinking from boards. We need them really to recognise that, in the long term, and not so far away now, businesses will only continue to survive and thrive if they're recognising that their existence depends on sustainable development.
Yeah, very interesting. I mean, it really is getting hot in the kitchen, but resolving that issue isn't just about, turning the climate temperature down. It's about looking at sustainable development holistically, and that was a really great perspective, Carol. But and taking that a bit further, I wanted just to check in with Jonathan on this primary concern of mitigating climate change. Should boards be looking really at mitigating climate change in their own business and mitigating the impact of climate change on their own business? Or should they be concerned with this broader concept of climate justice? How issues of climate are affecting, the broader world, including those countries and regions that are in, energy poverty or other types of poverty or access to basic needs. Should boards be concerned with these broader topics, or are they really should be focusing on their own impact and interaction with climate change? What do you think about that?
Well, I think this brings us one of my favourite topics, which is disclosure horizons, and this whole question that Mark Carney, the chair of the Financial Stability Board, used to talk about the tragedy of the horizon, where we're taking, if you just think about this year and next year, then you'll make fundamentally different decisions than if you're thinking 5 years, 10 years, thinking about the impact of your business and then the impact of all of that back on your business model, including the reputation of your business with your stakeholders. So I think we've got to box out of these short-term horizons. And I think if you box out of those short-term horizons, then the gap between the kinds of issues that Carol was talking about and the kinds of issues that sometimes we hear from people like Mark Carney and the Finance Day at COP, which was about how we get the finance community back net zero and back the businesses that are absolutely 100% committed to this and make this mainstream, then I think that whole conversation in a way collapses, because I think you align the interests of society with the business, with the capital markets. And I think that's what we've got to do. We've got to get back to having an aligned system. And I think it is more fundamental than just adding one new disclosure requirement, one new framework. This is about changing the conversation that we have between business and society, and then creating a new structure, a new architecture standards and frameworks that meet the needs now of sustainable development, which we absolutely need, and is fundamental, not just to the security of the people who are going to be hardest impacted by climate change, coming back to your climate justice point, which is absolutely fundamental, but also to the security and stability of the global economy. So I think everything, as Carol was saying, everything is connected, and we need to think fundamentally as we're designing the system. And we all know that there's a lot of work going on at the moment, European Union, IFRS Foundation, and so on, to design the system. We need to be building in consideration about how you have interoperability between the needs of our society over the long term and the needs to generate the capital in order to finance that transition today, so that we have both a stronger economy and a better society, and meet those needs together. And I think we're capable of achieving that.
Great. Well, that's super optimistic. The proof, as they say in our kitchen, will be in the pudding. But perhaps we can talk to one thing that everybody's saying is like the golden solution to everything, climate change related and beyond, and that is carbon pricing. Should boards favour this option to regulate and decarbonize markets through a mechanism such as carbon pricing? Michael, what would be your take on that?
It's a good question. I'm reminded of a survey we did last year, I believe. We do an annual survey of investors to understand the impact of our work, and one of the questions was, is reporting helping to shift us to a lower carbon economy? And most have said yes. One comment in addition to that was yes, but a global price on carbon would help more. I think that's a really good point. It's back to Jonathan and Carol's points around that sort of bigger picture thinking, putting everything in the context, and making sure that the playing field is set up for success. So I think it would be it's a really helpful tool globally and also internally as a management tool, if appropriately priced, of course, to drive the business. And that's really an operationalization of some of those commitments and other strategies, as you do. So I believe so, yes.
Thanks. Anyone else have a thought on carbon pricing as a means to force markets to address these issues? Eduardo?
Yes, we do believe that. Sorry, Carol, did I catch you?
Okay, Eduardo, go ahead and we'll pick up with Carol.
Thank you. So just a couple of points. I do believe it's very important on one side. On the other side, I think to have it pass it politically is going to be very complicated. And I'm saying this, and I'm sorry if I always compare to Switzerland, but we have a very direct democracy. And just a few months ago, even if everybody is quite keen on being environmental friendly, they didn't pass a law to have a simple carbon tax in Switzerland. And evidently it was a very emotional decision, not very rational decision. So I think it's very difficult, but it's something that we need. And there are corporations that use an internal carbon pricing, and I think that's the first step that they should do, so that they already start thinking in that trajectory. And then evidently we have a global one will be great, but if there is none, or if the regulators start having one internal.
Carol, did you want to add something on that?
Well, I think it's it's useful, but it doesn't remove the need to really encourage a change in behaviour and beliefs, and that need to facilitate that transformation to thinking about sustainable development. So not just waiting and hoping that the objectives of society and the environment and organizations collide and their needs collide, but actually actively adjusting the way that boards think and the values that they have to recognize that they can't survive unless we move towards sustainable development and and tackle climate change. So a useful tool, but not enough.
Yeah, just one ingredient. And we need more. Okay, thanks for that.
Elaine, there's one,
yeah,
just one, if I may, just one element that I'd like to just introduce as well, which is that, I mean, I think we've seen that with the pandemic, the awful pandemic that we're still living through, that, you know, it's possible to get to net zero if you close down your economy. And we've also seen through incredible innovation of a small number of exemplars in the world, they have transformed their business models. And there are now some companies, in small number, but nevertheless, some companies starting to align their entire strategies around the SDGs, and that's phenomenal. But we need to mainstream this work, and we need to do it in a way that doesn't close, you know, that doesn't mean that we have to close down our economy in order to get there. So the other ingredient, if you like, into this conversation that I think is also important is what we call the intangibles, or the innovation. So in other words, how are you going to change your business model? Well, you need to be able to put a value on your R&D spend. You need to be really thinking about how you incorporate your intangibles into this conversation in sustainability and sustainable development. That's something the EU is now beginning to do as well in their conversations about sustainability reporting. How do you include that innovation nugget? Because that's how you're going to change the business model. That's how you're going to be able to continue to drive progress for your employees and for your shareholders and for your financial stakeholders, as well as meeting your commitments, these essential commitments to sustainable development. We're seeing companies do that, but we need to mainstream that work. So
Sure.
just include that intangibles element in.
Sure. And I was reading the other day about the development of Scope 4 thinking. So how do we incorporate, you know, everybody's got enough headaches with reporting GHG emissions Scope 1, 2, and 3, but Scope 4 is the nice piece of GHG emissions, where we talk about how companies are mitigating or improving climate change, and so maybe that's another piece of disclosure that we'll get to in the future. But I think it's all very good to talk about, hey, we've got to do everything. Hey, we've got to look at this holistically. Hey, we've got to make sure we're thinking in broader terms, you know, all the sustainable development, climate justice, you know, long term. But in reality, today, boards are having to make trade-offs. No company today can do everything. And the biggest pressure at the moment on boards is to address the climate change issue. So Darren, if I come back to you, I'm wondering if you have a thought on, if there is this need to prioritize, what do you deprioritize? What goes, what's less important? What would boards, you know, have to go slow with in order to go fast with addressing climate change? You have a thought on that?
So I think perhaps building on Jonathan's point about the intangibles and innovation, to me, it isn't about deprioritizing, it's about changing the way that you do business. Because fundamentally, this is nothing short of a green revolution if we are to decarbonize and to stay within the limits set by the Paris Declaration. Businesses need to fundamentally change the way that they operate so that we can reach those goals. And it goes back to, how can you tell if a board is taking this seriously? It needs to be more than window dressing. You need the data and the disclosures to show we are changing what we're doing and how we're looking at this to really face the future. And that brings with it just as many opportunities as it does bring challenges. So I don't see it as a trade-off anymore that any of the other many competing issues that boards have to deal with now. It's not a different scenario, but it is about taking a very holistic approach. Yes, there's 17 different sustainable development goals. Yes, you need to take into account most of them, but this should be how you align your business to be future ready. And if a board isn't making that step to be future ready, then they're probably not fulfilling their governance requirements.
Yeah, thanks. Great perspective, and makes a lot of sense. It's not just about tweaking something, it's about really reevaluating your entire way of doing business. And I think, we've started to see, as Jonathan said, I think we've started to see some companies doing that. But how are we then measuring companies' success in doing this? I mean, Eduardo, you're in this measurement field, evaluation, rating, ranking. I mean, how is this being captured? Is that field changing to accommodate and to encourage this new way of thinking? Just as an aside, we talked a lot about in our first panel, there was a lot of talk about culture and passion being key ingredients of a good board. But how many of the standards, frameworks, ratings and rankings, evaluations and analyses actually measure culture and passion? They measure the hard numbers. How is the measurement aligning itself with this new need, as Darian, Jonathan, all our panelists are saying, to be more holistic?
Well, I mean, looking at ESG was the first step that was taken in order not just to look at the financial numbers, and then of course there are different nuances that can be included to measure the passion. Is still, I think, a next step, which is a bit more complicated. What if we go back to the climate issue? What I just want to make a remark that is also to show where also for us is complicated. Things are moving very fast, and expectations are moving very fast. 18 months ago, we discussed the changes for the question that has been answered by the corporates this year. We didn't introduce net zero because it was a concept too new that we believe not many companies were already dealing and aware and so on. Something that, if I think about it, is a bit ridiculous because now everybody is net zero, or at least in words. Yeah. Just to see how quickly all these things are moving. So also we have a little bit of difficulties to make sure that what we develop now in 2 years still makes sense, because to change the methodology takes between 1 and 1.5 years. Let's put it this way, and it's very difficult, because what today is considered absurd, maybe hopefully in 1.5 years or 2 years will be business as usual. And what worries me most, and what I think should also be a priority beside climate change, is how to move the awareness of the people. I'm being very scared to see how people react against the measure for COVID, even if it was science-based and was affecting their life directly, immediately. If we project this into climate change, we see how complicated it is to pass the message, and this is something that for me should also be prioritized, because otherwise we will again have a separation of the society, because this transition, even if we talk about 2050, it's going to be fast for the whole economy. It's going to be very fast, and when things move fast, then there will be losers and winners. People that are already ready, and the ones that are not ready, they're making a lot of resistance. And we have seen with COVID that we get also violence. So I don't know the solution. And I'm sorry for not having answered your question, maybe, but I think it's also something that we should really consider.
No, absolutely. As it's been said many times before, we're all in the same kitchen. And I think we all need to play a role. Before we move on to, I've got like 1,000 more questions, but I won't be able to get to all of them. But maybe we've got a couple of questions from chefs in the audience. Any questions from our audience, Rajesh, or shall we just keep rolling on?
Yes, chef. There are a couple of questions. So.
Okay.
So one question I see here is that, well, we are asking companies to address climate change through lots of things, production, risk management, measuring, and so on. But is it going to work, leaving it up to profit-making entities without stricter regulation? So the question here is that, can we leave it to companies, or we need the tough hand of the regulation?
Carol, yeah.
So answering that and partly Elaine's last question, I think organisations have to disclose their approach to strategy and their governance oversight. And there's plenty of evidence that can be gathered by assurance providers to demonstrate that they've done that properly. And so that external assurance piece is important. But, you know, we do have to be sceptical. I was reading today a survey that's just been sort of released by the Australian Institute of Company Directors of their members, and 46% of them apparently said they want their boards to do more on climate change. Now, 46% of them, that on average is about half of all corporate boards, or half of all boards. So in some of those boards, the ones who want to do more must be in the majority. And so why isn't more happening already? So there is this inertia, and that's something that we need to give a kick. There needs to be a jolt, and you know, people need to start living by their values and taking action and not waiting for someone else to do it. And so we do need to be skeptical. They can do more, but we do need to be skeptical.
Great, thank you. Darian, yes.
Perhaps coming from the regulatory perspective, you know, in Singapore, the Singapore Exchange consulted last year with listed companies on what mandatory climate-related disclosures could look like. The Monetary Authority of Singapore will be looking more broadly across other financial institutions and what those mandatory climate-related disclosures could look like. And so you do have a role of regulators in enforcing certain levels of disclosure, and that can bring with it consistency and comparability. It can bring methodology to the way people make these disclosures. But ultimately, companies and their boards need to decide what makes sense for their business. And so it isn't a one-size-fits-all. It's not that it will only happen because it's mandated by regulators. Ultimately, and to Carol's point, you know, we all need to get to this low-carbon future. There will be different pathways, but boards will need to help guide their companies on how to get through that pathway whilst sticking within the regulatory framework.
I just want to add, Elaine, to what
Sure.
you said, that, you know, MAS is one of the first, or probably the first regulator in the world to require financial institutions to report on their climate risk. And those guidelines were issued in December last year, and there's a deadline of, say, June next year that they must report on it. And we have seen a very definite momentum in the market among these companies, like insurance companies, banks, and asset managers, to really, you know, wanting to comply actually and take interest. So regulation does work in Singapore for sure. There's one more question.
Right.
To take that, Elaine. Do you have time?
Well, just one quick question with one quick answer. Go ahead.
Okay. So the question is very straightforward. TCFD actually focuses on mitigation. What about adaptation? So is it not important? That's the question.
Michael, you want to take that?
I think, you know, TCFD in many ways covers both as well. Adaptation, you know, risk management is one of those areas that a key focus of it as well. So I'm not sure I would agree with that statement. It's really about looking at holistic risk management, of your business. So, to the extent, these are risks, and you need to manage those things, whether that's mitigation or adaptation. So I would say it covers both.
Jonathan, any thoughts on adaptation as a climate change response?
No, I think I would agree with Mike. I mean, and I think, and it's been highlighted previously in the panel discussion, I think one of the greatest insights, the two big insights I think from TCFD from our perspective is, first of all, the scenario analysis. Secondly, the use of existing financial reporting and risk management processes, so that you're actually having, at the end of the day, one dashboard incorporating climate risk into all of your main CAS allocation decisions. And I think that is a fundamental shift. And there's been a lot of talk in the world at the moment about consolidation. And I think in many ways, the TCFD was the first effort at that consolidation, of bringing together the different tools and different resources and making sure that they work in a more holistic way. So I do think it's part and parcel of the fundamental change that we want to see.
Thank you. And we're going to wrap things up. Before I do, is there anyone who has a burning last sentence, or have we all got our messages across? Anyone like to say any final words? No, okay. Well, we've had Eduardo, sorry, you raise your hand.
There is something that I assume not a lot of people are understanding when they talk about net zero, is that your actual carbon emission, you cannot compensate them by making somebody else not emitting other carbon emission, because your carbon emission will still stay in the atmosphere. You have to compensate with people taking away your emission, and then we understand how complicated will be the path to net zero.
Sure.
It's and I think we have to burn a bit more into our heads that it's not just, oh, I will pay somebody else to do
absolutely.
to emit a bit less. I think it's very important to have in our mind. That was it.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, the world is putting so much emphasis on net zero. It really would be a great idea if we actually understood what it means. And what it is committing companies to. But let's hope that we're going to get there. I think this has been a really fascinating deep dive into the issues around climate change and the issues that boards of directors need to be grappling with in order to lead their businesses and our world and their role in our world forward in the future. We've gone from sort of very specific advice about what boards need to be doing. So we'll all remember your 3Ds, Darian: definition, data, and disclosure. We'll never forget that. And we've talked about holistic thinking. We've talked about eating your vegetables. And even though they may not be the best, they are the healthiest. And a whole lot of other really fabulous insights from all of you. Thank you all so much for a great panel and a great discussion.